Hello and a warm welcome to Tata Literature Live. We're on day 7 right now. The 11th Mumbai International Litfest is the first one to be completely digital, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Tata Projects. There will be a 15-minute Q&A at the end of the session, so please do send in your questions in the comment section of the platform that you are viewing from. An author par excellence, whose versatility sweeps across ancient Rome to a chillingly dystopian future via the Second World War, contemporary politics, and a papal election. Robert Harris is the author of 14 best-selling novels, including The Ghost, An Officer and a Spy, Pompeii, and most recently, V2, published in September this year. A fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, his books have been translated in 40 languages, and many of them have been filmed. Robert Harris will be in conversation with author and Ashoka University professor Jonathan Gil Harris. He is the author of The First Firangis, remarkable stories of heroes, healers, charlatans, courtesans, and other foreigners who became Indian. In his most recent book, Masala Shakespeare, How a Firangi Writer Became Indian, Gil maps the world of masala films based on Shakespeare's plays. A very warm welcome to our speakers, Robert Harris and Jonathan Gil Harris.
Well, thank you very much, and it's my great pleasure to be here and to be in conversation with my long-lost cousin, Robert Harris, who is actually no relation. But I have long been related to Robert, at least through his literature, which is a treasure trove of fiction and non-fiction, history and speculative fiction about the future. So I want to start off by asking Robert. He started off not writing history, because his very first book was about chemical and biological weapons, but sometime in the 80s he published a book on Hitler's secret diaries. But after that he moved into writing fiction, and historical fiction in particular. So Robert, maybe you can start off by talking a little bit about that transition and what it means to be writing historical fiction as opposed to history.
Well, hello, Gil. Nice to meet you. I'm sure we are related in some way. I see you as a long-lost cousin. Yes, I was a journalist. I left university and became a journalist at the BBC and then in newspapers. Always I wanted to write. And I wasn't particularly bothered what form I was writing in, just as long as I could write. And I wrote non-fiction books, as you say, which kind of culminated in a book on the forged Hitler diaries scandal of 1983. And that book led me to read Hitler's Table Talk, which is sort of monologues that Hitler delivered at his headquarters, outlining the world as it was going to be. He delivered these monologues in 1942 and 43 when he thought he was going to win the war. And they struck me as the world was so fascinating that was conjured up. I thought, well, I'll write a non-fiction book about it, what the war would have been like. But when I came to try to write that book, I found that it was so speculative. I really needed to invent characters to try and describe what the world would have been like, and the story of it as well. And so I found myself writing fiction purely as a tool to get at what I wanted to say. For me, that's what fiction is. It opens up a whole new kit of things that I can use to communicate, as well as it being a pleasure to me to invent characters and so on. And I like history. I think that to try and write novels about the present, of the sort that I'm interested in, about political issues often, it's crazy to try and do it, because by the time you bring the book out, the world would have changed. Everything is changing so quickly. Whereas there are kind of eternal truths, if you like, of human behavior and response in history. And so that's really that's become my field, really, mostly.
You have, ever since that first piece of speculative fiction about the Nazis, Fatherland, you've been fascinated by World War II history, Nazism, Fatherland, and Enigma, all the way through to your recent novels, Munich and V2. And you were saying that you sort of shy away from writing about the present because of these truths that can be accessed in the past. How much are these histories of the past also histories of the present and for the present?
Very much so. I think even if you're not aware of it, actually, I mean, if you range over the whole of human history and an episode or a character calls out to you and you decide to write about it, even if you're not really conscious of it, you are in fact reflecting some contemporary concern. And so I think that this idea of historical fiction as sort of carriages and galleons and jewels and funny clothes and so on is the wrong way to look at it. Really, historical fiction is contemporary fiction as well. I mean, and in my books in particular, self-consciously so, the trilogy of novels that I wrote about Cicero, for instance, covering the 25 years of the Roman Republic, were an effort to write about the rules of politics, the laws of politics, the kind of characters you get in politics that would be as relevant whether you were in Britain, America, India, or wherever. That there are certain types of people, certain types of situations arise, and for me, it was a way of escaping the parochial and writing about politics in a world that, well, really in many ways invented modern politics, and is sort of, it frees me from the awful roman à clé, you know, oh, is that about Tony Blair, or is that supposed to be Donald Trump or something? You know, you can clear that out of the reader's mind.
And of course, Adam Lang is as related to Tony Blair as Jonathan Gil Harris is to Robert Harris.
Well, it's funny that having made this great declaration about how I would never write a roman à clé about a modern politician, I then, of course, in the way of fate, then quickly found that I was doing something similar.
But let's turn to your most recent novel, V2, which is fascinating, not least because its title character is, in fact, not a person, but a thing, a rocket. And I'm very curious about the representation of this title character, because at times the rocket almost becomes, if not human, then at least sort of deeply personalized. And Rudi Graf, who is one of the co-inventors with Wernher von Braun of the V2 rocket, from the early days where we see him working with prototypes like the repulsor rocket that he builds as a fairly young chap, to the time of the V2, the rocket is described as she. And for me, this is kind of surprising, given how, well, you don't have to be a Freudian to recognize how phallic rockets are. These pointy things that shoot out and go bang. But there is a history of feminizing weapons and instruments of mass destruction. And I'm thinking of the infamous Enola Gay bomber that dropped the atom bomb on Hiroshima, for instance. So what for you is the psychology of this feminization of the V2 rocket and other instruments like it, for Graf, for von Braun and others?
Well, you're right that V2 is, I mean, I should explain to people watching that there are two main characters, human characters, Rudi Graf, the German engineer, and a woman who works in British intelligence, an English woman called Kay, who is sent to Belgium as part of an actual real-life operation to try and find out where the V2 rockets were being launched from. They were launched from the coast of Holland at London and would strike London 5 minutes later. And the V2 is a kind of third character, you're quite right. And partly the title is meant as a pun, as V for versus. You know, the novel is structured so that chapters alternate German, British, and so on. It's about conflict. And for me, in a way, writing the novel at the time in this my country's history when it's parting from Europe, it was a sort of, I'm constantly stunned by the fact that within living memory, 76 years ago, one European power was occupying another and firing ballistic missiles at the capital city of a third. That seems to me extraordinary. So that was at the back of my mind in writing the book. As to the feminization of the weapon, I think that simply comes from the fact that ships, of course, have always been feminized. I suppose that's when it started, and I don't know what the roots of that are. But I think it's also true that a lot of the language of sea travel was imported into space travel, and is generally imported into moving objects, I think. It's true that the Germans would have referred to her, she's flying well, as to the priapic nature of the rocket, I don't know. I mean, obviously there is something terrifically phallic about the whole idea of a rocket launching. I don't know that necessarily fights, though, from the feminization. Maybe this makes it a very modern book. It's the first. It's the first World War II trans novel.
One of the things that is most arresting about this novel is that these characters, the human characters, as opposed to the rocket itself, are motivated by a great deal of idealism that has somehow been conscripted by the war. The V2 rocket starts, of course, on the part of von Braun and Graf as the sort of expression of a hope for space travel and putting a human on the moon. Of course, the V2, there's something sort of wonderful about how you describe its trajectory. Instead of going up, well, it goes up, and then Graf has this brief moment of regret as he sees it tilt 45 degrees to the side to begin its parabolic movement from Belgium, from Holland to England. Of course, we're going up not into the stars or to the moon, but to mass destruction. This must have involved a huge amount of research on your part, and not just history, but also physics and mathematics. Can you talk a little bit about the process of doing this research and how it might have brought you face to face with this sort of head-on collision between wide-eyed idealism of young scientists and the sort of realpolitik of intercontinental ballistic warfare?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, the novel does. I mean, I didn't start out with a fascination with V2 and wanting to write a novel about it, which would be slightly weird. I came across an obituary about 4 years ago in the Times of a woman who died at the age of 95. Her name was Eileen Younghusband. She'd been an officer in the Women's Air Force in Britain during the war. She was sent to Belgium in November 1944 with a group of 8 women officers. By this time, the V2s were really causing a lot of terror in London. I mean, they hit London at the speed of nearly 2,000 miles an hour, and they could be heard all across the capital. And sometimes you could get as many as 5 or 6 hitting London, a sonic boom, and then the thud as it hit the ground. And so the British sent out this team in a desperate attempt to try and track where the V2s were being launched from, because they came from mobile trailers in the woods near The Hague, and they simply couldn't find them from the air. And the theory was that they were ballistic missiles. They described a parabolic arc, so you could work back from where they'd hit in London. You had a brief radar glimpse of their trajectory, and then putting these calculations together, you could trace the arc back to the pinpoint spot in the woods. And they were given, the women were told they had 6 minutes to make that calculation after it hit London. If they could do it, then the RAF could get a plane over the woods before the Germans could escape. So I read that in an obituary, and I just thought this is a fascinating story and potentially a very fascinating character, a young woman billeted on a Belgian family, newly liberated Europe, and this race against the clock. So she came first. Then obviously I knew that I needed the Germans firing these missiles. And I thought about having a soldier. And then I decided it would be much more interesting if he was actually one of the scientists who developed the missiles, because it was so technologically sophisticated, the weapon, that the scientists were sent out to, some of them, and attached to the military units so that they could iron out any problems. And then I started looking at his life, and of course, it was a Faustian bargain for these young Germans. I mean, they were teenagers when they began in the 1920s, fooling around with homemade rockets on waste ground near Berlin. But von Braun, who is a character in the novel, was not only a brilliant engineer, but also very shrewd, politically ambitious as well. He saw that the only way that they would ever be able to get a spacecraft, which is genuinely what they wanted, was to get government backing, and that meant military backing. And then before you know where you are, they're on a Baltic island with a kind of 20,000 workforce rocket city almost, and they're working on a weapon of war. And the moral dilemmas of that, as they were sucked further and further into the horror of the Third Reich, is a darker underside of the whole story. And, you know, the trick was to somehow plait these two things together. And yes, there's a lot of research. There's the British side, the intelligence operation, the locations, the building of the missiles, the German troops that fired them. There's only about a dozen interviews with these guys, and most of them would now be 100. So you're unlikely to ever hear their testimony. So it was an effort of the imagination. I was writing other books as well. I wrote Munich and I wrote The Second Sleep, but I kept researching on the side, V2, and then I finally started writing it in January of this year.
And you completed it during the COVID lockdown? I
did. I mean, because I was a journalist, I think it was probably there that I got the habit, but I need adrenaline. You know, I find that unless I have to, unless there's something spurring me on, a mild panic, as it were, I don't see things so well. And I'm a great believer in that kind of pressure that speeds up the mind, and it's particularly good for the sort of books I try to write. So I started in January, aiming to finish the book at the end of June, and then I'd written about a quarter of the novel when the whole pandemic hit Britain and we were locked down. And for about 3 weeks, I couldn't work because, to be honest, I thought, who needs a novel about the V2, frankly? It's hardly top of the world's priorities, and also, would it even come out? But then, as one got used to the situation, I thought, well, I will at least try and come out of this whole mad period of house arrest with something to show for it. And so I sat down at this desk and I wrote it. And I think some of the circumstances under which it was written, this almost wartime atmosphere of a mounting death toll, a panic, of ordinary life upended, and no end to this in sight. I think that infected or connected me in some strange way to wartime, and at the same time, I needed to write it quite tautly and tightly because I was having to concentrate on it so hard. So the book is a product of that whole period.
Well, it does strike me as sort of eerily, uncannily contemporary at times. That sense of lockdown claustrophobia is present in the book. For instance, in the scenes where Kay is billeted in the town in Belgium by Dr. Vermeulen and his family, but also reading about the enormous amount of money spent by the German government on armament and rearmament. and seeing how much the war effort was allowing for entire new cities to be built, as per von Braun's plan to launch the rocket. And then suddenly it's 10,000 rockets. So it was kind of uncanny to hear a couple of days ago that your Prime Minister has authorized an unprecedented increase in funding for the military. And I'm just trying to work out, in a time like COVID, what exactly is the rationale for a massively ramped up defense budget for wars?
Well, I think it's probably partly distraction and also the need for the Prime Minister to appeal to the right-wing elements of his own party, the kind of flag-waving. And I think it ties in with the whole Brexit, the obsession of my country with the Second World War and of being an independent island power. Fantasies, I fear. And one of the things that's underlined my historical fiction, one of the things that I've used fiction to try and do, is to just question, in a way, this. So all the books are slightly edgy about the war, I hope. I mean, I didn't try to write kind of gung-ho propaganda. Enigma is about the British turning their blind eye to a crime committed by their great ally, the Soviet Union. Munich is very specifically about the decline of British power, and actually the fact that Chamberlain had a much more realistic grasp of what was likely to result in a war than Churchill did. And V2 again is, as I say, it's I hope a different kind of war novel, not least because the rocket is a kind of hinge between one era and another. I've written two novels set in these great scientific places, one in Bletchley Park where the computer was developed, one in Peenemünde where the rocket was developed. And all that I'm missing really is Los Alamos where the atomic bomb was developed. And it's in those three places with thousands of scientists all herded together with all the cross-fertilization that can happen with that, with money no object and under pressure of war, that the world took these leaps forward. And we, when people say, oh, God, you're still banging on about the Second World War. Well, it shaped us, both at least in Europe, both politically and technologically. We still live in its shadow. And in Britain, the kind of the wartime nostalgia is very, very strong. And I wanted to, so I think that's why I wrote the book. Whether I'll do another book set in that period, I slightly doubt, actually. I feel I've said all I wanted to say about it.
Well, turning to some of your other fiction, two of my favorite books of yours are works of speculative fiction. And of course, any work of fiction is speculative fiction, but these are specifically books of subjunctive history, sort of based on the premise of what if. So Fatherland imagines a world in which the Nazis won the war and are still in power in 1964, and in which President Kennedy, not JF Kennedy, but his anti-Semitic father Joseph Kennedy, is running for re-election. And The Second Sleep, which came out fairly recently, imagines what seems to be at first a medieval Catholic England, which then turns out to be something like 800 years in the future after a mysterious apocalypse has wiped out our modern civilization in 2025. So I'm curious, now that you've written two of these what-if books of speculative history/futurity, what is the peculiar attraction of speculative fiction for you as a writer, but also for us as readers? Because these are sort of very mesmerizing Alice through the looking glass scenarios that you've come up with.
Well, my great hero, as I was growing up as a teenager, was George Orwell. I think I've read everything by him. And There's a wonderful phrase of Orwell's. His aim, he said, was to turn political writing into an art. I was always fascinated by politics. And what I think Orwell meant by that was not beautiful phrases or exquisite writing. He meant using tools of the imagination, normally associated with an artistic, a work of art, to apply them to politics, and most notably with Animal Farm, of course, and with 1984, a novel which is perhaps been the most influential upon me of any book. It's clear there in Fatherland, the influences of 1984, and it's also there in The Second Sleep too. And so I think I'm drawn to these things because precisely because they're really political books, actually. I mean, Fatherland says, okay, we all go on and on about the Holocaust and how evil Hitler was. But if the Nazis had won, would we really have behaved any differently towards them? By we, I'm here meaning the rest of the world and America in particular. Would we have treated a victorious German regime any differently to the way a victorious Soviet regime or Mao Zedong's regime were treated? They were treated on the basis of realpolitik, and that's really what I wanted to get at in that novel. And in The Second Sleep, similarly, I'm quite perturbed by the wonderful technology which is enabling us to have this conversation now, that our dependency upon it and what, in particular, social media is doing to our minds. One would have thought that to have a device in your pocket which gives you pretty much all the world's knowledge, literature, paintings and so on, we would be on the verge of a great era of the Enlightenment. On the contrary, we're in an era of conspiracy theories, superstition, and you know, you only have to look at what's happening in America now about the election result, with so many people believing it's false. So that was a way of working that through. Imagine if the whole thing suddenly completely blew up and we were left, what would we be like in centuries from now if this world, which we assume will go on forever untouched, just as Cicero did with the Roman Republic, what if it had actually all come to pieces? I mean, every generation thinks that the life is stable, but maybe it isn't. The pandemic, in a way, has given us a glimpse of the fragility of our civilization. And I'm not particularly a gloomy fellow, to be honest, but this tends to be this subject that fascinates me the most, the thin veneer of civilization and the ease with which it can disintegrate.
Yes. In The Second Sleep, it's really almost shocking the way in which we move from thinking that we know what world the novel is set in. It seems to be a 14th century English novel with sort of familiar characters from our understanding of medieval English life in a village. We have a priest and various artisans, and then a parakeet flies into frame that doesn't seem quite right. So we think, hello, there's something funny here, but then it flies out and we forget about it. And then all of a sudden plastic makes an appearance in the novel, and we realize, oh goodness, we have to completely transform our assumptions about what this world is and when it is set. Now, there's a very important character in this novel named Morgenstern, who's sort of the Cassandra type figure from our time, who warns the scientific community, and I presume the larger community, that we're potentially very vulnerable because in this age of technological accomplishment and profound connectivity through our smartphones and laptops, we're actually extraordinarily vulnerable because of our lack of provisions. We only have 2 or 3 days worth of food in the fridge nowadays. And all it would take would be for a complete shutdown of this sort of global system that sustains us, for us to be sort of thrust back into a Lord of the Flies type situation, which is precisely ends up happening in the novels, or 800 years before it starts. But I'm fascinated by this character Morgenstern, because over the course of the novel, the main character, the priest Christopher Fairfax, is sort of trying to find out more about Morgenstern, what he knew, what his world was. And at the end, without giving too much away, Fairfax encounters Morgenstern's tomb in the countryside. And we have a sense of Morgenstern having become, after this apocalypse that changes everything, a very different character. So first of all, can I ask, is there going to be a sequel? Will there be, after the second sleep, a third sleep? Will we find out more about Morgenstern?
I don't think, to be honest, having written the novel, been through the pandemic, I can face going back and giving myself a third bout of such gloom and doom, to be honest with you. I'd written about ancient Rome, Pompeii and the Cicero Trilogy. I'd come across archaeology. I mean, I'd read a lot of archaeology and scholars piecing together, inscriptions and so on, to piece together what the past was like. And it occurred to me that it would be quite interesting to do that about us. So, that immediately meant that the book would have to feel to the reader as if they were reading a historical novel. And you would think that people were researching ancient Rome or the Celts or Saxons. And then gradually, do you get the clammy sensation that they're discovering bits of plastic and actually they're investigating us? And that was the start of trying to write the novel. And what would this calamity have been that struck the world? And the novel lists the various possibilities, one of which is a pandemic. Obviously, there's global warming and super volcanoes and asteroids and all the other various things, nuclear war. But the one that seems to me the most plausible is a kind of cyber war or a virus or something that paralyzes the internet, put it crudely. And if you can imagine a world in which your communications aren't working, your power supply collapses, and money, you can't use your credit cards, you can't take money out. Very quickly, particularly in a country like England, with a just-in-time supply, where all our food is on the roads, in lorries being brought in to supermarkets, that looked like a great sort of cave, Aladdin's cave of plenty, but actually they're slightly an illusion because they're restacked, hour by hour, constantly from these cars. If that all stopped, in the cities in particular, where it's said that London is only 5 meals away from starvation, the panic would spread and so on. So this was the cheery subject that I set out to write about, and I just finished that and finished doing publicity for it when the pandemic happened. So I feel as though I've done my share of misery.
So what next then? Given that you've done your share of misery and lived through a fair share of it, can we expect a happy novel in which skies are blue and peace breaks out all over the world, or do you?
Well, I'm sure if you look back at what happened after the Spanish flu pandemic, if you just wanted to guess what people would want, they will want the equivalent of the Roaring Twenties when this falls behind us, and they will want. I'm sure comedy and escapism, and I just go on picking on stories that interest me. I'm researching something now set in the past again. It's not that I don't want to write a novel set in the present, but by and large, those novels that I've done age quite quickly. The Ghost, for instance, about the ghostwriter and the ex-prime minister, is a book very much of its time. And the thing about writing novels set in the past is they don't date. They are as fresh, now as they may have been 20 years ago. So I don't pick on them for that reason specifically, but I do think one of the things, unless you're a novelist of social reportage, which of course is a fair and strong tradition, but unless you're that, what you're trying to do, I think, is to find something underlying theme or some grand structure which illuminates and is beyond, what are the hidden levers that are moving us all. And in this world that's changing so quickly, the past is quite a good way to look at, to look at things. I mean, the impact, as an academic studying literature, you probably know this better than I do, but the impact of modern technology on the actual narrative structure of a novel interests me, because if you take Pride and Prejudice, Mrs. Bennet would know all there was to know about Mr. Darcy and the people who've moved in up the road from the internet. That whole thing, and the whole teasing nature of discovery in a thriller or a detective story or social behavior collapses. Our literature is going to be over in an instant. A whole 5 years pass in 10 minutes now. So that's another argument for setting novels in the past, because people still behave like human beings as we expect them to do.
Yes.
And there is a narrative structure.
I'm trying to imagine Mrs. Bennet's Twitter feed, and actually I can almost do it. There's something sort of quite gossipy and 50 characters about the way she engages the world. But I wanted to ask you to play Morgenstern for a moment, because I sense some sort of occult affinity between Robert Harris and Morgenstern in the Second Sleep, the man who is predicting the vulnerability of civilization. What do you think lies in store for us beyond the Roaring Twenties? And I'm talking here not just about a post-pandemic world, but a world in which we have seen the rise of a kind of populist nationalism as a global political currency, from the United Kingdom to America to here in India. What's going to emerge out of this?
Well, obviously, I mean, I know no more than anyone else, but yes, of course one ponders these things. On the one hand, I am optimistic. I mean, for instance, we're not there yet, but if you consider this pandemic, the extraordinary human ingenuity and brilliance, which seems to have discovered a completely new form of vaccination, and the possibility of rolling it out to billions of people next year. I mean, this is an astonishing achievement. And although we beat ourselves up as a species for the appalling things we do, we should also bear in mind that it's not by accident that we've come to be so dominant on this planet. But this is astonishing. So I'm optimistic in some ways that the great problems that faces climate change and so on, I suspect that once human ingenuity is turned, maybe belatedly, but turned, then don't write us off, I suppose is what I'm saying. So on an optimistic note, I would say that. And I would also just point out that a lot of my books have been about scientists or engineers who fascinate me. Not that I have any skill at all in science or engineering, but it seems to me that they power the world far more than soldiers and statesmen and priests, that it's really the engineers and the scientists. So to that extent, I'm optimistic. I'm pessimistic about democracy, I must say. I'm not at all convinced that it's the natural state of humankind to live in democracy. And I think that the moment there is no longer any agreed standards of truth and proof, then I don't see how democracy is supportable. And what has happened across the world with the rise of these regimes and the denial in America of the election result, for instance, or of reality, of provable reality. The belief that there are great global conspiracies, that the FBI and the CIA mounted 9/11, which have been quite seriously held and advanced to you by intelligent people. This troubles me because for the first time, the voice of an element of humanity, which has always been, well, has been mildly suppressed, actually, is now free to express itself, and with dangerous consequences. So I'm a mixture of optimism and pessimism. I can certainly see a form of mild authoritarianism being the way of the future. I wouldn't be surprised, I'm afraid.
Well, I'll grasp onto the optimistic part for now, not least because I can almost hear in your remarks the shadow of another novel appearing, which is about the scientific work that is being done to produce something like a vaccination post-COVID, or at least a vaccination that can take us, hopefully, into a post-COVID world. So even though one of the themes of your writing seems to be sic transit gloria, that the glory and the power of something that we take for granted can ebb in an instant, whether it's an apocalypse or it's the eruption of Vesuvius, there's always a sense that extra gloria wanet, that another glory, another possibility will come in its wake. So I was going to turn now to questions from the audience, and I have a few to hand here. One member of the audience wanted me to ask you, what triggered your interest in Cicero, the Roman rhetorician? What is it about him, above all the characters of that time, that attracted you to him?
Well, I'd finished writing my novel Pompeii, and I'd enjoyed setting a book in the Roman world, which for me, is both an attempt to recreate the past, but also is a sort of allegory of our own time, or you can write about the Roman world as a way of writing about our own world as well. And I'd been a political journalist, and I wanted to write a big political novel. And suddenly it struck me that the last 25 years of the Roman Republic, where you had these extraordinary characters, Caesar, Cicero, Pompey, Crassus, Cato, and so on, and they were at one time all together in the Senate, that you could write the ultimate political novel about these characters. And Cicero was the obvious one to choose as the main figure, because first of all, we have 800 or so of his letters, some of them very intimate. We have his speeches, his books, his philosophy. We know more about him than almost anyone in history, actually, certainly in ancient history. And he's a very modern figure. His sensibility is very modern. And is sympathetic. I mean, he was not without his flaws, pomposity, duplicity, and so on. But even those I find quite modern and accessible. He was not cruel. He winced at the games and disliked war. And he rose by his oratory and his skill as an advocate, and forged what seems to be a modern political career. He built an electoral machine. He learned how to speak. He won over crowds. He was cunning. He stood for election. He seemed to me also an overlooked figure. I mean, in Shakespeare, Cicero gets about 8 lines. I mean, he's most writers have ignored him and focused on Caesar, and I find the virtues of a Cicero, the moderation, the attempt to be a statesman, as it were, like a physician, to heal the country, to do the best for most people, whilst at the same time being, hypocrite and all the other things that go with being a politician. He seemed to me the perfect way of trying to write about politics, and as I say, in a way that would be understandable in any country in the world, I would hope.
Did you set out to write a trilogy when you started writing the Cicero series, or did it just end up playing out that way?
I didn't write at the very beginning. I lived near Oxford. I drove up to Blackwell's in Oxford and bought all 29 lower volumes of parallel texts of Cicero. And at the moment I started going through that, I realized that if this was to be done properly, it couldn't really be encompassed in one book. It would just be too huge. I mean, I'm glad to say that the 3 novels are coming out together, revised in one volume in Britain next year, because that's the way I wanted them to be read, as one huge story. But it was just not technically possible to cram it all into one book. And I did 2 years of research for the whole trilogy before I started writing Imperium, the first volume, so that I knew what was going to happen, all the way through. I thought the whole project would take me about 5 years. In fact, it took me a decade, because I broke off to write other books as well.
Yeah. So here's another question from an audience member. Is there a universality of humanity, morality of any kind, that links all the eras that you straddle?
That's a very good question. And I think that if there is an underlying theme, not being pompous about my work, it is that people don't really change. The ancient Romans were pretty similar to us. Of course, there was cruelty, although when you look at Auschwitz and Hiroshima and the rest of it, horrors that the ancients might have recoiled from. I don't think we're in any position to feel superior to them. But there's no better poetry, really. There is no better speech making. There's no more sophisticated a constitution. The only thing, I mean, they didn't have the music and they didn't have the technology, but otherwise, they were like us. And I think that is the theme of my books, that really people don't change that much. And there was, 2,000 years is a bat of an eye in evolutionary history. And so wherever I set a novel, yes, I think that people obey the certain same sorts of rules. There's a kind of quantity theory of humanity, that there's a tiny percentage of geniuses. There's about 50 to 60% of people are pretty decent. There's about 35% who are crazy, going down to the psychopaths who you must keep out of power at all costs. And I think the proportion of psychopaths in a society to geniuses, or to decent and to less decent, I think those proportions, that mix, is probably constant, actually. And where societies go wrong is when the psychopaths are allowed into power. And one of the things which I think is worrying is I think it's perhaps getting a bit easier for them to do that. Look around the world.
Absolutely. When you speak about how the Romans are a lot like us, I think, particularly in Europe, obviously, but in many parts of the world, we continue to be obsessed with the Romans as versions of us, precisely because they were powerful and things kept falling apart. The Roman Empire, the Roman Republic, then the Roman Empire endured so long, but things could fall apart so quickly. But if there's one episode apart from the period of the Republic that you were describing in Imperium and the Trilogy that most commands our fascination, it is Pompeii. And the continuing vividness of Pompeii for us is, I think, illustrated beautifully by the news that came out just today, I think, or was it yesterday, that a perfectly preserved pair of bodies from Pompeii had just been exhumed, seemingly of a master and a servant, curled up in fetal position right next to each other. And with Pompeii, we seem to have a sense of here they are with us. We can see them almost as they were, but they could almost be us too. So would you talk just a little bit about why Pompeii continues to so fascinate us year in, year out?
Yes, it does. And I think that anyone who's been to Pompeii, I think almost everyone who's ever goes comes away slightly changed by it. It does alter your perspective on the world and mortality, I think. That this bustling, thriving place with the graffiti and the art and all the rest of it, the characters, was suddenly obliterated in the way that it was. It was the turn of the century that I was thinking of writing a novel about America set in the future, and couldn't make it work, and veered off when I read something about new research on the destruction of Pompeii at about 2000. And I thought, well, that would be interesting. Why don't I make, because I was going to write a novel about a kind of Walt Disney Corporation and Florida and Celebration, their model town in Florida. I thought it'd be an interesting utopia under threat. And I thought, well, why don't I make Pompeii my celebration and make the Bay of Naples my Florida? And it was before, I'd like to think, it became a cliche to compare modern America with Rome. What was interesting, and what is interesting about this discovery today, is that, of course, we discovered the ruins of Pompeii in the late 18th century, and we started discovering the bodies, or what we discovered actually were cavities, which we filled with plaster, and then took them away. And there, in the molded, we saw the figures, which we've just had 2 more came out yesterday. What is very interesting is that all these bodies, all of them, were found at roof height in Pompeii. And I've talked to archaeologists about this. Why didn't nobody ever point out that fact? Because until the Mount St. Helens eruption, no one really knew what had happened in Pompeii. But nobody ever thought to say, why is everyone 10 feet off the ground? This is because the city was slowly filling with ash and debris and pumice, and people were clambering up, onto their roofs. And it was only the following day that they were destroyed, when the eruption column collapsed and the heat was swept over the Vesuvius. So, our view of that eruption and what happened has been utterly transformed in the last 30 years or so. It's the way that the past is not immutable. It is constantly changing. Our view of it constantly changes. And so now we have a completely different perspective on Pompeii to that which we would have had when I was a child, for instance, the way you were taught it.
Yeah. Why are we so fascinated, we almost rubberneck viewing the destruction of ancient cultures? This kind of story is fascinating, but we're also fascinated reading stories about the destruction of our own. Second Sleep is partly about that, but I'm thinking of other fiction like John Wyndham's The Chrysalids, or even for that matter, and forgive me for comparing this to your fiction in the same breath, but The Planet of the Apes, where we discover that this seemingly extraterrestrial civilization of simians is in fact living in the ruins of our own modern civilization. Why are we so fascinated with the possibility of our own extermination? We read every day about asteroids that have come within a whisker of destroying Earth, almost as if we're willing the asteroids to come. Why is this something we're so obsessed with?
I think there's a sort of, it's basic to human nature, I think, and basic to all our stories and our collective history. I mean, so the Bible is full of the flood, of apocalypse, disaster, and I suppose that in human history, the wars, the famines, the plagues that have swept across, they punctuate our history, and they are assimilated into our culture and into the sort of people we are. So I think we're always looking around for the next thing that's going to happen. And people like this sort of, disaster, if I may put it this way. The story of Titanic, for instance, is of endless fascination of the civilization of the liner, the last word in sophistication, that just hits an iceberg, and there's nothing that can be done despite all the brilliance that's gone into it. And the very fact that you know how that story ends, just as you do with the destruction of Pompeii, doesn't mean it's less interesting to read. On the contrary, the compulsion of the narrative is driven by the fact that you know it's all going to end very badly, and you're waiting for it to happen. And this, of course, is Greek tragedy, that we know how it's going to end, but the way that we get there is is what grips an audience. So you follow along with fascination. And these are just the stories that humanity likes to tell itself. I think probably in the caves when they came back after a hunt, they were describing some terrible calamity which might sweep across them.
I can't resist asking this as someone from the outside, but to what extent is Brexit, which we're sort of watching unfold right now, to what extent is this the Titanic hitting the iceberg?
Well, I mean, it's not going to be as bad as all that, of course. It's, you know, a good rule in life is that things are neither as bad nor as good as you think that they are. It's a strange thing that's happened, and it's for novelists with my preoccupations, it's fascinating to see the way in which a nation's history is like its character. It's woven into it. However far you seem to move on, you don't really. This remains an island, an insular country that is never happier than when it's on its own, and that has woven for this generation a great Arthurian sort of myth, grounded in some reality, of course, of the war and of a glorious epoch. And to witness that, to see it now play out, and to see these national characteristics, because to some degree it seems wrong to talk about nations having characteristics, of course, but somehow, nevertheless, they do, a product of history, geography, and so on. And certainly that's what we're seeing with Brexit. So for someone who's a student of history and tries to write about it, it's been an extraordinary time to be alive and to witness it. And we will see in the years to come exactly what the effects of it are. But they will be profound, just as the effects of the Trump presidency. It's not going to end in January, the effects of that. We're on a staging post. Brexit's on a staging post to somewhere, just as the Trump presidency was.
Well, I think that we have pretty much run out of time here. So I want to thank you, Robert, for really illuminating and lively discussion about your fiction, about the world that we're living in, about the worlds we have lived in, about the worlds we are fascinated by. And thank you very much. And I hope Harris and Harris get to meet again somewhere else.
Yes. Thank you, Gil. I'll see you at the next family reunion.
Terrific. And I'll hand things back to Gillian Pinto here. Gillian, are you there?
Thank you. Thank you, Robert Harris and Jonathan Gil Harris. I hope you invite me to your next family reunion. I'm just joking. Thank you for this very engaging conversation and for taking the time out for being with us today. Thanks to our title sponsor, Tata, and to you, our audience, for logging in and for sending us all your questions. It's the last day of this edition of Tata Literature Live, and you don't want to miss a thing. Coming up at 6 p.m. IST is Dreaming Up Multiverses with Neil Gaiman in conversation with Jerry Pinto. Following that, at 7:15 p.m. IST, Farid Zakaria speaks to Barkha Dutt about lockdown learnings. Stay logged in.